The way and manner my Thakur outlines the philosophical contours as well as the finer nuances of the ideas of both karma and rebirth is remarkably unique in its style and most brilliant in terms of its significance, power, and impact, I should say. You must be aware that the religious traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, they all accept the doctrines of karma and rebirth, although their respective conceptions of these doctrines often differ in their details. Understood? They all believe in the moral quality of actions, good, bad, otherwise, which they think to shape their future state and circumstances, either later in this life or in a subsequent birth. If you closely examine, then you will see that those traditions which are sustained by the essence of the Vedas and the Upanishads, in those traditions, the doctrines of karma and rebirth always go hand in hand, even though in principle these doctrines are conceptually separable when considered from different philosophical schools, like say Kopiler Shankho, Patanjaliর যোগ, গৌতমের ন্যায়, কণাদের বৈশেষিক, জৈমিনীর পূর্ব মীমাংসা, or ব্যাসের উত্তর মীমাংসা, which we call Vedanta. From an absolutely theoretical standpoint, it is possible for there to be rebirth without karma. But in such a scenario, rebirth could simply be considered as a mighty raw force without any kind of moral or spiritual rationale. Like, say, why and under what circumstances we are reborn. Similarly, it is also theoretically possible for there to be karma without any further birth, if all the karmic effects of one's actions were to take place in a single lifetime. So rationally and logically, the rishis and the sages of the Upanishadic tradition, they consider karma and rebirth inseparable, for the very reason that the karmic effects of one's actions often tend to fructify only in a subsequent birth. Okay? Furthermore, it is karma which furnishes the underlying moral and spiritual rationale for birth. Now, according to the Sanatan traditions of Vedanta, Shankho, Yoga, or even Gautam's Nyaya philosophy, there are several reasonably strong arguments in favor of karma and rebirth. Even by combining multiple mutually supportive arguments from the different schools of Sanatan philosophy, we can arrive at something which may provide a very powerful support base to the idea of karma and rebirth. But the problem is, ideally we can't find any finishing blow or a knockout punch which comprehensively and decisively may lead to the indisputable and unquestionable acceptance of this idea of karma and rebirth and influence the practical consequences of action or karma. In my Thakur's ideas, I find pretty clearly this extensive and exhaustive knockout punch, both in terms of philosophical performance, spiritual outcome, tangible result, and its surreal beauty. Now, one may find the earliest known reference of the doctrine of karma in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. There we find Arthabhago asking Rishi Jagyavalkya, what happens to a person after death? And Rishi Jagyavalkya answering, there in the Upanishad you will find Jagyavalkya Tiubacha, Yashasya Purushasya Mritasagning Bhagopeti Batang Prana. and it goes so on. The Upanishad then explains karma by saying punno bhai punnena karmano bhavati papo papena, which is very simple, which means one indeed becomes virtuous through good actions and vicious through evil actions. Now, both the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and the Chandogya Upanishad describe two paths, the northern path or the Devjan and the southern path or the Pitrijan. Here, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad describes in a little more detail what happens to the soul after death. We find in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, eki bhavati na pashyati tahu, eki bhavati na jigrhati tahu, eki bhavati na rashayati tahu, and it goes on like this, which means that the I consciousness of the sthula sharir or the physical body gets united with the I consciousness of the sukha sharir or the subtle body after death. And likewise, physical body knows with the subtle body knows, physical body tongue with the subtle body tongue, and it goes on. You must have found mention of this idea in my Thakur's wonderful discussion on the concept of soul, which my Thakur delivered on 2nd September 1985. Likewise, if you look at the Bhagavad Gita, you will find that in the 20th slok of the 2nd chapter, Krishna says, Na jayate mriyate ba kadachin nayang bhutta bhavita ba na bha ajo nitya shashvata ham purano na hannate hannamana sharire. So the idea of karma and rebirth is there in the Brahma Sutras, in the Upanishads, in the Bhagavad Gita, in Buddhism, Jainism, and etc. Some may accept the idea of Atta, like the Vedantins, some may not, like the Buddhists, but the idea of karma and rebirth are very strong foundational pillars of most of the Eastern philosophical and spiritual traditions. Now, the doctrine of karma basically means that resultant consequences follow the very nature of our actions. We reap what we sow. Now, you may ask, what does it actually mean? How exactly do we reap what we sow? What is the inner mechanism through which we are presented with the deserving outcome of our karma? Here I find that this particular question has three distinct explanations. One of metaphysical nature, then next comes what you may call a psychological or a psychical explanation, and the third is a proper spiritual and fundamental explanation. My Thakur's take on this subject is this final and decisive third explanation, which I describe as the knockout punch. Why? I am trying to explain. Let's start with the first two, the metaphysical explanation, the metaphysical narrative, and the psychical narrative. Look, the Upanishads and Yoga texts describe our karma and its effect as dharma, punna, sukh, and adharma, pap, dukkha. What does it mean? You perform dharma, which means a good action, that generates punna. Now this punna idea is absolutely a metaphysical quantity, as you can't observe it, or more precisely, your sense organs can't experience it. But it is there, absolutely there, just there. Understood? Now because of this punna or karmic merit, one consequently experiences favorable circumstances in this life or in a future life, which is another birth. In a similar fashion, if one's karma is bad, if one performs adharma, then it generates pap or karmic demerit, as a result of which the doer of adharma will confront unfavorable situations later in this life or in a later birth. This is what the doctrine of karma emphasizes upon. Dharma leads to punna and then sukh, and similarly adharma generates pap, which gives birth to dukkha. Now, what is the second one, or the psychical narrative of the law of karma? Look, Every action we do, every thought we take up, creates a sanskar or a latent impression in our chitta or mind or in our psychic plane. Good action develops good impressions, bad action generates bad impressions or sanskaras. But good sanskaras are prone to engage ourselves in the same kind of behavior in the future. Likewise, bad karmas also do the same and go on building a personality which we may call a bad personality. But this also has another profound after effect, or you may call it consequence, of binding us more firmly to the bondage cycle of birth and death. More good karmas, more accumulation of punya. More bad karmas, more stockpiling of pap, and in the course of regulating and keeping the account of your karma perfect, legitimate and overboard, you are destined to keep on taking more and more births and embrace more and more deaths. This cycle tends to go on eternally. It is thus extremely difficult to break free from this seemingly eternal bondage of birth and death, and the prescriptions provided in the spiritual texts to encounter this most fundamental problem of our existence at times sound theoretically brilliant, but when considered from the practical perspective, they lack certainty and also evidence. Now, here enters my Thakur, which I have mentioned already as the third description or the spiritual and fundamental explanation. My Thakur fully accepts the law of karma and rebirth, but what he does is so unique that I haven't found any such comparable precedents in the annals of the Sanatan texts all put together. My Thakur takes the absolute charge of his devotee, takes upon himself the entire baggage of all the past karmas of that devotee. Obviously, you will agree with me that most of these karmas are extremely bad karmas. And finally, my Thakur, owning the responsibility of those enormous bad karmas, suffers himself from all the resultant consequences and outcomes those bad karmas are supposed to generate. Ultimately, my Thakur breaks the bondage of the seemingly interminable cycle of birth and death of his devotee and releases him or her from the most perilous predicament of one's entire existence. This is why I have described this as a knockout punch. Only an intelligent and intuitive soul is able to understand that the most harrowing and tormenting experience is the experience of this seemingly boundless cycle of birth and death. So, no one, and I should say absolutely no one, can love you more than my Thakur. No one can be more precious than my Thakur. He is your closest companion, your most trusted guide, I should say, your truest soulmate in every sense and interpretation of the word.